The Wall Street Journal, Tuesday, November 3, 1992, by Eric Morgan Fowler, staff reporter for the Wall Street Journal. Happy is the man whose life is getting out of chains. Every night, Tim Hanneman is bound and locked up. He almost always escapes Key West, Florida, amidst all the economic gloom and doom. It's easy to forget that this great land is filled with happy people who love their work. Some are farmers, out there work at the zoo. Then there is Tim Hanneman. He earns his living by standing on a pier at sunset, being bound in a straitjacket, chains, handcuffs, and locks until his face turns purple, then racing to free himself before he suffocates. "I love my job," says Mr. Hanneman, who on a good night earns more than $100 in contributions from people who watch his escape. He usually affects it in about 12 minutes, though his best time is 12 seconds and his worst an hour and 50 minutes. Mr. Hanneman, who goes by the stage name Tim, is a full-time escape artist. He has been doing escapes as a street performer for 25 or so of his 47 years, the last 8 as a regular at the nightly sunset celebration on the pier at Mallory Square, one of the top tourist attractions in this tourist town. He prides himself on doing his escapes without tricks and within full view of the audience. A proud record. Mr. Hanneman says that in his career he has failed to free himself only 23 times and stresses that only a couple of those were that I gave up. He explains the out there, "I passed out a war-torn muscle or had out there problems like that." Some find that an odd way to spend a life. "We sometimes call him Peter Pan in bondage," quips Harry Powell, who as pier manager, referees the sunset goings on. But Mr. Hanneman, a muscular man with longish brown hair and a thin mustache, finds his work liberating. "The first thing I want is a good challenge," he says, "as the people place me into the straitjacket, the chains, the handcuffs. I meditate on what they are doing. It's like a big puzzle, and I execute a solution." One of his riskiest escapes involved being bound in the usual fashion, then chained to a chair. To get the maneuvering room needed to loosen the chains, he says, "you have to fall, and the only thing to break your fall is the head." He says he does that escape only about 4 times a year because it is really dangerous. Why do it at all? To keep in touch with the challenge, he says. Mr. Hanneman grew up in Indianapolis, but he left home at age 15 for California and drifted through a string of jobs. He was a dance instructor at a Hollywood Boulevard studio, where he adopted the professional name Tim, being the studio manager's son's name. He quit for the Hollywood Wax Museum, where his job was to scare visitors in a horror chamber by pretending to be a wax figure, then moving. Next, he was hired by a movie studio to do pantomime for tourists on its lot. At the time, Mr. Hanneman was rooming with a man who did escapes from straitjackets as a nightclub performer. When Mr. Hanneman asked to learn the ropes, his friend responded by putting him into a straitjacket, then into a nylon bag, which he tied at the top. "And 5.5 hours later I got out of it," Mr. Hanneman says. "I kept asking him, those 5.5 hours, for advice," he says. "The only advice he would give me was, the only way it's going to have any value to you is to figure it out for yourself." And I think he was right. In the years since, he has done escapes throughout the country. He now works in Key West most of the year, but he takes off around Memorial Day and travels a summer circuit that can take as far north as Canada before returning around Labor Day. In Key West, he usually arrives at the pier by mid-afternoon in the 1979 brown Ford van where he lives with his dog, Unlock. Mr. Hanneman says he has been married like 3 times and has about 7 children. After the drawing in which pier positions are assigned to the 15 or so performers, regulars ranged from a bagpiper to a juggler to a trained cat act. Mr. Hanneman begins to set up. He lays a brick-colored mat on the concrete pier, then neatly arranges on it his straitjacket, 5 sets of 25-foot stainless steel chains, 2 pair of handcuffs, and 4 locks he buys at Sears. He also sets out a pail for contributions. About half an hour before sunset, he blows the whistle, shouts "showtime" over here into his handheld microphone, and starts to draw a crowd from the hundreds of people strolling the pier. Neighboring performers don't always take kindly to him. On a recent evening, the sword seller was innocent because he felt Mr. Hanneman, who had the space next to him, was stealing his audience. And a tarot card reader groused that Mr. Hanneman's sound system was drowning out everyone else. Tim is probably the most consistently disruptive person on the pier, known for eccentric people, says Mr. Powell, the pier manager. Mr. Hanneman denies that and accuses authorities such as Mr. Powell of hassling him. Once a crowd has gathered, Mr. Hanneman calls for 2 volunteers. He has them bind him in a straitjacket, then the chains. He has them start the first 2 chains around his neck, the third midway around his body, and the fourth anywhere they want. Don't be afraid, pull as tight as you want, Mr. Hanneman tells them, though he asks for enough room to fit a little finger between his neck and the chains. Lack of oxygen is not to be used as a restraint, he says in laying out the rules beforehand. Paint is not to be used as a restraint. He also tells the audience where to find a set of keys, colored in case of trouble. The chains are tightened and secured with the handcuffs and locks. By the time the chaining process is completed, after maybe 25 minutes, Mr. Hanneman's face is purple, shading toward black. He stares straight ahead, trance-like. Watching Mr. Hanneman free himself is rather like watching water boil. At first there's not a lot to see. It is clear he is straining tremendously, but he loosens his bonds, slowly twisting and shaking, shrugging and jerking, sinking to his knees, rolling on his side. As chains visibly loosen or fall off, the audience often applauds or cheers. Mr. Hanneman says there's no one secret of his success. It's hard work. He says but breath control, muscle control, and meditation are very important. I totally relax, he says. I meditate. Everything is designed for you to fight against it, the straitjacket, the chains, the handcuffs. I do the opposite. He says escape skills can be taught, but it would be difficult for people to pick them up on their own. The experience helps, too, once you learn how to escape from a pair of handcuffs. They are all the same. Mr. Hanneman says you can pick the pair of handcuffs in 2 seconds. Among Mr. Hanneman's near-term goals is to do his escape while strapped to a piece of chain-link fence, which would be suspended and revolve like a wheel. For the longer term, he hopes to earn enough to escape underwater beneath the canopy of burning oil. People tell me that's impossible, he says. But everything I do is supposed to be impossible. An article. Key West, Houdini and the Artistry of Escape. Tim Hanneman likes to be chained up. For 28 years, he's been letting strangers do exactly that on a nightly basis. But what Tim likes even more is getting out. Hanneman is the last true escape artist in the country. He's been compared to Houdini, but even Houdini used tricks. Hanneman uses no tricks or gimmicks, just concentration, flexibility, and experience. In Key West, tradition mandates that Icelanders and visitors gather on Mallory Pier to watch what is touted as America's finest sunset. What began as an innocent excuse for a kiss and a drink has evolved into one of this nation's finest freak shows. Swords are swallowed, $22 bills handed out as a gimmick in a man named Love's presidential campaign, and semi-domesticated pets leap through hoops. But Hanneman, known on stage as Tim Herrick, is a consistent attention grabber. As Bob, a 60s marketing executive from Boston, said while watching Hanneman, I've seen a lot of sunsets, but I've never seen anything like this. Far out, Tim left his home in Indiana at the age of 15 and became an armory dance instructor in Los Angeles. Although he liked the dancing, he felt that some of what was required of a dance instructor was a little unethical, so he began to work in a wax museum scaring people. At first I wasn't so good, he admits, because my eyes would drift, and people would touch me and realize that my body was warm. Not only did Hanneman learn to keep his eyes steady, he mastered a biofeedback technique that enabled him to lower his body temperature to that of, essentially, the corpse. He became such a sensation that the fire marshal requested that he take his act to the sidewalk where the crowds could gather without impairing fire egress routes. During this time, Hanneman had a roommate named Bernie Orlando, and Bernie was an escape artist. I started out in a straitjacket with fewer chains, Hanneman recalled, and Bernie put me in the nylon bag. Unfortunately, Bernie never gave Tim any advice other than escape artistry is something you have to figure out on your own. I was in there for 5.5 hours, he says. Hanneman worked diligently at his escapes, incorporating them into his sidewalk show. I was doing pantomime comedy at that time, says Hanneman, and everybody was always expecting me to be funny. So I started my act with an escape so I could show the audience another, more serious side of me. 11 years ago, Hanneman moved to Key West for the warm weather. After 3 failed marriages, it's an occupational hazard, he says, and the birth of his 7 or something kids. Hanneman began performing on Mallory Pier. His brother Don performs a bit further down the pier. Don holds the world fire blast record. He can blow fire 8.5 feet. It takes him 4.1 seconds to blow the fuel out of his body. Their eldest brother, Charles Hanneman, is running for state senate in Indiana. When we were little, we used to play cowboys and Indians and tie each other up, remembers Don, and Tim always used to get right out. Showtime. Hanneman stands in his tights on a bucket and shouts it's showtime at approximately 6:20 every night. He tests his audience with an applause meter to make sure the show will be worth his while. If the audience passes the test, the show goes on. After getting 2 volunteers from the audience, he instructs them in the rules of tying his straitjacket and of chaining him. Be careful of my crotch. Snug but not tight. He requires that his shippers be able to fit at least a pinky between the chain and his body. The chains are then locked using padlocks. Hanneman thinks that women give him more of a challenge. Women try to make up for their lack of strength by getting really into it, he says. Shannon, a college student from Ohio, volunteered to chain Hanneman up. Certainly fits this description. The tighter it got around his neck, the more I started to think twice, she said, but it became more of a challenge to make it as restrictive as I possibly could. As Shannon chained him up, she showed signs of remorse. Oh geez, he's got a serious legend. Tied up once chained, Hanneman's skin turns from tan to blue to indigo to gray. It's from lack of oxygen, he explained. The heavy smoker then goes on to complete the rules he establishes for his audience, pausing intermittently to walk, chained, to the end of the pier for a coughing hand-splitting attack. He requests that no one call the emergency squad, as has happened in the past. I hate tying up the emergency equipment, says Hanneman, who claims that he's never been scared while performing an escape. Hanneman's brother Don also feels that the act is a bit dangerous. He's going to die doing it, says Don, his 51-year-old brother. And I'm going to take his collection hat from that night and buy him an urn, throw his ashes right off the pier. Recently, his companion, Georgia McLaughlin, lost her cool. The people chaining him up were evil, she explained. They were real evil. McLaughlin called the Key West police, who then proceeded to take her away. They wanted me to leave the island, to escort me out of town, she says. McLaughlin has become much more accustomed to the act since then, and will even use the napkin to wipe the spit from Hanneman's mouth as he performs the escapes. Usually the audience is more agreeable, however. Hanneman explained that he sometimes watches videos of his audience after the fact. The audience members will be all contorting while they're watching me, and I can learn a lot from that, he says. Also, both Tim and Don like to watch the other brothers act and offer pointers. It's like the days when we were 9, he says. For the most part, Hanneman loves his job. He earns an average of about $130 a show. The worst part about it is the competition on the dock. Lots of people are copying me, he says, but they're using tricks. During a showdown with one such mimic last summer, Hanneman claims that he remains the only one on the pier able to successfully extricate himself from the straitjacket alone. I think the audience can see that I'm the real thing, he says, and they appreciate that. But this is America, and we've got freedom of speech, and I guess that means freedom to lie. OHGs. He's got a serious legend. There are no tricks to what Hanneman does. He is tied and chained up and he gets out somehow. I'm not double-jointed, but I am flexible, he says. The act is a form of meditation that begins as he is being chained up. I tune out everything, he says, and start concentrating on how I can get out. He writes, squirms and rolls around on the mat until it happens. My record is 12 seconds, he says, but my longest escape is 1 hour and 50 minutes. In 28 years, Hanneman's chains have been unlocked for him only 25 times. It's usually been from a lack of oxygen. I just pass out. He'll stop nothing short of passing out. One time a rainstorm came in while I was chained up, says the man heralded as the next Houdini. All the tourists, the arts and crafts people, the other performers, they all left. but I stayed here and I got out alone in the storm.